Well, good morning, everybody. Glad you are here this morning. And we are wrapping up our 3-week series called Practice Not Perfection. And we've been looking at 3 different practices in our life that God would love for us to do on a consistent basis because they'll help in our relationship with Him. They'll help us grow closer to Him. And we'll see those blessings in our life. So today we're going to dig into the practice of generosity. The early church would not have survived without generosity. Within weeks of the birth of the church on the day of Pentecost, there were more than 10,000 new believers in Jerusalem. The Bible says there were 5,000 men alone, and so if you add in wives and children, it was a massive megachurch born in those first few weeks. And that was fantastic news, but the church had a crisis on their hands pretty quickly. Many of these new believers had traveled great distances to come to Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost. It was one of 3 pilgrimage feasts in the course of the Jewish year where every Jew from around the globe would try their best to make it back to Jerusalem. And so they came. And when they learned of God's love and grace through Peter's message, they accepted Christ. And their lives were forever changed. And there was a great deal of excitement and buzz and enthusiasm around this new church, and so they stayed longer than they had expected. They packed for a long trip, but not one this long, and that created problems. As days turned into weeks, they ran out of food, and they ran out of money, and the housing situation changed, and so they turned to their fellow believers for help. And an amazing thing happened. Luke records in Acts 4, all the believers were united in heart and in mind. And they felt that what they owned was not actually their own, so they shared everything they had. And while the apostles testified powerfully to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, God's great blessing was on them all. And then hear this. This is an amazing statement. There were no needy people among them because some of the people who owned houses and land sold that and brought the money to the apostles to give to people in need. They sold huge possessions in their life. They sold massive amounts of land to help support these new believers who were in Jerusalem. And I think as I read that, there is for most of us a gap between our practice of generosity and what happened in this early church. But I quickly go to wondering, what would happen if we could get to that place of practicing generosity? How would it change my heart? How would it change my daily decisions? And what would be the impact on our community if each one of us today decided to take another step in practicing generosity? One of the reasons I think the early church was so generous is because growing up in their Jewish faith, they had been taught this kind of belief system from birth. They grew up believing that generosity is not so much about what I have, it's about how I think and how I view the possessions that I've got. People in the early church believed this to their core before they became a Christian. They said, the passage in Acts says, they felt that what they owned was not their own. It's a biblical perspective. It's taught throughout the Bible. These Jewish Christians had grown up with passages like these. 1 Chronicles 29, everything comes from you, God, and we've given to you only what comes from your hand. Or Proverbs 24, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. Now, that's not the case for many of us. We didn't grow up learning these things. So when we come into a relationship with Jesus, it takes time to adjust our thinking, to adjust our values and our habits, and to learn to live the way Jesus teaches about this practice of generosity. Even if you grew up in a Christian family, this may not have been taught. I know my parents were generous in some ways, but just in general, we didn't talk about living generous lives. So it took me a lot of time in my adult years. It took a lot of influence from my loving wife, who is a gracious giver and a generous person by nature, for me to grow in this practice of generosity. Practicing generosity starts with developing a new value, that everything I have comes from God and it's His to use as he pleases. When Paul was writing to some new believers in the city of Corinth, he said this: you need to remember that now he who supplies the seed to the sower and bread for food. Now I'm going to stop there. Not many of us are farmers in the room, I'm going to guess. Given our current weather status, you could begin to be a rice farmer in your backyard today, but that's not what we're talking about. In Paul's day, you didn't have like seed corn and then corn that you would grind to use to make meals for your family. All the stuff came out of the same bag. So like you had a bin or a basket or a bag of wheat in your barn, and you'd go out and pull some and you'd grind that up by hand in order to make bread. But that was also the same sack as a farmer that you would turn to when it was time to plant crops, and you would plant your seed from that same bag. And so Paul says, the one who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed and enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. And this is in the context in this passage of being generous. And he says, and if you do that, you'll be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion. In Paul's day, farmers had two ways of planting seeds. The first was time-consuming and tedious. You would take the seeds a few at a time and you would set them in the soil and you would cover them gently with your hands, push them into the soil. You use that kind of a planting method when your wheat's running in short supply, when your reserves are running out, when if this doesn't come through, this harvest could be your very last. It's a tough choice because you have to decide how much of this seed am I going to plant for next year's harvest and how much am I going to keep back to feed my family until that harvest comes. Another method was sowing seed, and you've probably seen this kind of a picture more when you think about seeds. It's where a farmer would simply grab a handful of seed from a basket over his shoulder or a bag, and he would broadcast that seed over the ground, just toss it over the ground. It was a much more generous way to plant seed. You didn't count on every one of those seeds springing to life, but you had a much larger potential harvest ahead of you if you planted seeds that way. But it was a risk to plant generously. You do that, and you're the kind of a farmer who puts seed in the ground on the front end of the deal, trusting that God is going to supply food for your family and income for your family on the back end of the deal. Through this imagery, Paul is encouraging those believers and us to trust God, to supply not just what we need, but more than we need, so that we can be generous on every occasion. It can be tough to trust God that way, right? It goes against logic. It goes against common sense. Conventional wisdom says the more we give, the less we have, right? So I want to just be very graphic in an illustration this morning. So I have some money up here. I have 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 20, 40, 60, 80, $200 in my hand. If I give nothing away, how much do I have? It's not a trick question. Okay? If I give away 10% of that, let's say, I just give $20. How much do I have? I know math is hard, especially before 11. Okay? But hang with me on this. If I give 20 away, I have 180. If I give nothing away, I have 200. Which one is greater? 200. So if I give this away, it is just simply human nature to think that being generous means I'm going to incur some kind of a loss. I'm going to lose money. I'm going to lose time. I'm going to lose energy. And all of that could have been spent on something else instead of giving this away. Because generosity demands us to be okay with loss. Or does it? I ran across an interesting book this week called The Paradox of Generosity by Christian Smith. He is a sociologist at Notre Dame. I found the book late in the week, so I'm just going to confess this right here and now. I found this book on Thursday morning. I did not have enough time to read the entire book. I confess that. So I did what any modern student would do. I went online and I read summaries of the book. There is no evidence in the book, in the preface or in the content, that Christian Smith is, in fact, a Christian, which I find ironic. He approached his research simply from the viewpoint of a secular sociologist. And regarding this idea that being generous requires us to accept a loss, here's what Smith has to say. It's fascinating. Not so. Not at all. The reality of generosity is instead actually paradoxical. Rather than generosity producing net losses, in general, the more generously people give of themselves, the more of many goods they receive in return. Sometimes they receive more of the same kind of thing they gave away: money, time, attention, and so forth. But more often, and more importantly, his words, generous people tend to receive back goods that are even more valuable than those they gave away. They receive happiness and health and a sense of purpose in life and personal growth. Generosity does not require us to sustain a loss. In fact, it's quite the opposite. When I read that, in my mind, I flipped to Jesus' words in Matthew 16, where he says, whoever wants to find their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. He was teaching this paradox. The Bible is clear all the way through about the benefits and the blessings of generosity. But to hear it from two secular sociologists, to see the statistical data that's there to back up what the Bible's been saying all along, is not only affirming, it was just a little shocking. It was a pleasant surprise on Thursday morning. Letting go of some of what we own actually makes life better for us. By giving ourselves away, Jesus would say, we move closer to the rich, full life that he has promised us. Generosity requires us to get comfortable with this paradox. When we give, we receive. When we grasp, we lose. The Bible says this in multiple ways in multiple places. Most clearly to me in Proverbs 11, where it says, one man gives freely and yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly but comes to poverty. A generous man will prosper, and he who refreshes others will himself be refreshed. The reverse is also true. From the Bible's teaching and also from this book, there is evidence to say that if we hold on too tightly to the stuff of our life, even if it's holding on to resources to protect ourselves against future uncertainties or possible misfortune, it has a profound impact on the quality of our life and our health. We become more vulnerable to future misfortunes rather than being protected from them. In short, by failing to care for others, we are not properly caring for ourselves. And so whether it's money or volunteer hours or acts of kindness, generosity coincides with happiness, good health, avoidance of depression, a sense of purpose in life, and personal growth. It's a biblical principle. It's a sociological fact proven by empirical data. Moving from grasping to generosity is an important step, but it's going to require us to consistently do generous practices, not just random acts. Our motive can't be, this is a sound investment strategy, right? I'm going to start to give my money away and I'll just watch my portfolio grow. Now, generosity can't be faked in order to gain something that we value. Generosity itself has to be the thing we desire. We must desire the good for other people, and that needs to motivate us. About a year ago this time, Connie came home from her work really just excited, and it was all over her face. She works at a free and charitable health clinic in St. Charles. They do all of their work off of grants, not government funds, grants and personal donations. So every donation matters, but this one blew her away. They'd gotten a phone call that day, and an anonymous group was donating $10,000 to their clinic. It was given to the clinic by a group of people in St. Charles called 100 women who care. 4 times a year, this organization makes one large or a couple of smaller donations to a very worthwhile organization. And they do it by asking each of 100 members to give $100. They won't ask them more than 4 times a year. And together as a group, they make this anonymous donation. She told me this story, and while I was happy for her, my wheels started turning. I went, this is just the coolest thing I've ever heard, right? Turns out there are groups like this all over the United States who've borrowed the name and borrowed the idea. If you do a Google search, it'll turn up 100 doctors who care, 100 teachers who care, 100 men who care, 100 women who care. Oddly enough, the only group I couldn't find was 100 lawyers who care. Not sure what that's about. My immediate reaction when she told me this was, we could do this at Westridge. We could. So I've been kicking around the idea for a year. I've been talking to the leadership, to talk to Lisa about it, and wondered, how would we do that? What would that look like here? Because we get some pretty daunting benevolent requests throughout the course of the year. Now, gratefully, over the past 3 or so years, we've been able to meet most of those needs because of a handful of generous people here. There are very few people here in this church who, that I know at least, who presented with a very significant need could write a check for $10,000. I mean, let me just rephrase that. I could write a check for $10,000. It wouldn't clear. That's where most of us are, right? But I firmly believe that there are a lot of us who could give 100. If we work together, we could gather $10,000 4 times a year to help families at Westridge who are in desperate need. We can do that. And so this morning, we are launching 100 Who Care here at Westridge. And our prayer is that over the next few weeks, that group will grow to be 100 families or individuals who care. And that will allow us, as a church, more of us to practice generosity, to offer help and hope to families in our church and our sphere of influence who are in desperate need. And I believe that we can do more together than we can do separately. So here's the ask this morning. Would you be willing to be a part of this group? And here's what we're going to ask from you. No more than 4 times a year, spread out through the course of the year, you'll be contacted and asked to donate $100. You can do more if you like, but that's the commitment you'd be making this morning. And circumstances in our life will change. Some of you may commit to that this morning, and when the request comes, you go, I just lost my job, I can't. That's okay. That's going to happen. But you sign up with that intent. I will caution you, however, that just what I've learned about being generous in my life is needs are seldom convenient. So it's asking you to make a sacrifice 4 times a year. We'll reach out to that group as the needs arise. We'll also let you know the impact of that generosity. But we'll do all of that in a way that protects the anonymity of the person who has the need and the anonymity of those who are giving. We're asking this morning that these gifts be over and above any other giving you're already doing. Please don't stop sponsoring your child in Nicaragua. Please don't take the money out of what you're giving to general fund and just reroute it. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for 100 people, 100 families who will take another step of generosity in their life. And when the needs come in, Lisa and her team have been vetting needs like this for 10 years. They're really good at this. And then keeping the anonymity has been happening for more than 10 years too. So we're good at that as well. Let me just say one more thing. We named it 100 Who Care. Don't read too much into that name. We're not saying if you can't do this, you don't care. And I know that some of us go there. The reality is, we just wanted to have a name that was memorable so you would know who it was coming from. And we don't do shame and guilt on a corporate level here. You may do it in your own life, but we don't encourage that. This is just easy to remember. Some of our most generous people here at Westridge live on a limited or fixed income. And for them, generosity is a consistent practice in their life. They've driven a stake in the ground and they've said, look, whether I have a lot or a little, it all belongs to God, and I will be generous and I will trust him. So we're not saying these are the only generous people. This is just a new thing that we're trying. So here's the challenge. Will you be one of the 100 who care? If so, you can sign up for that just simply by using our new Text to Connect. It's in the program this morning in 2 places. You just text the word I care. If you'd rather email, you can do that. Send your email. It'll go to Lisa at compassion@westridgechurch.net. Or you can go really old school, and you can talk to us. Scott Lyons cringed. Don't talk to Scott. That's what I read from that. You can talk to Lisa. You can talk to me. You can talk to Wally, Darren. We'll take your name, and we'll add you to that list. You can practice generosity even if you're technically challenged. Right? What we want is to take one more tangible step in practicing generosity in our lives. And I'm not asking you to do something I haven't done. My name was first on the list. I'm in. There's only one issue. There's only one item in all of Scripture where God literally says, I dare you. It's around the idea of practicing generosity. He's writing to the Israelites in a really difficult time in their life. And they'd been grasping instead of being generous. They've been holding back in selfishness and fear. And God says, I want you to give. I want you to see what happens. And then God says, test me in this. I'm convinced the original Hebrew said, I double dog dare you. He says, test me and see if I won't throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you won't have the room to store it in your house and in your heart. I've loved always that God lays out this challenge boldly. This is the only place he does it. And he says, test this generosity paradox and see what happens. You can test it this morning if your finances are a mess. Start small. Don't wait until you have enough, because you never will. Test this generosity paradox even if you're not sure about the whole God thing yet, and watch him work. Put God to the test. Be generous somewhere. It may not be with money. It may be with your time. It may be with your emotions. It may be with your attention. Be generous. Take a baby step forward. Do something. Keep your heart open to needs that God brings into your path this week. And as you see those needs, and as you help meet those needs in generosity, also keep your eyes open to see how God brings goodness and blessing into your life as you practice generosity.